Georgia, by way of Atlanta. And my partner in crime, Mr. Horton, is manning our Twitter page. So if you have any questions during the lesson or throughout, remember you can tweet us at virtual a push, and we will answer. We will do our best to answer your questions. One quick shout out, very quickly. We asked the question yesterday about guesses on the DBQ, and some responses kind of came in a little bit later. So Miss Chloe, she responded with two. First of hers was to evaluate the extent to which the Gilded Age and economic policies impacted politics of society within the 20th century. And then she came in with another guess of how the Civil War time period influenced the social, political, and economic changes and developments. So thank you for those guesses as we keep moving. And don't forget, as we're kind of going through and learning the additional content for period 9, we are definitely going to help you guys out with some skills that are going to be needed for you to be successful on this year's DBQ. So let's jump into our warm up. This political cartoon should be familiar. This is what Mr. Horton left off with. And you have to look at the picture, and it says, what event is being depicted and what is the artist's point of view? So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds just to review it for a second. Couple of quick reminders when you're looking at DBQs and you're looking at, especially for political cartoons, make sure that you pay attention to all the little minute details. You'll notice that this is actually depicting the Iran-Contra Scandal that Mr. Horton kind of brought up yesterday. You saw the video clip. If you'll notice, he is shredding documents, which was one of the things that happened during the whole scandal when they were calling prosecution was trying to find out information, and Oliver North claimed that he was instructed by his superiors to get rid of certain documents that would actually implicate himself or other individuals who were being tried for this. And so you'll notice that the American flag is also being shredded at the same time. But in this case, instead of the documents, he's actually notice the "We the People." So this is kind of implying that he is shredding up the Constitution. So basically, he is clearly violating federal law. So the artist's point of view here, when it says some documents were shredded, which was actually a quote from Oliver North, what he's basically saying is that he pretty much, the federal government was implicated inside of this, and that there were individuals besides Oliver North, because he had to have gotten his he had to have gotten his orders from somewhere. He was told to do something that basically violated the Constitution. It violated the offices, and of course, as Mr. Horton mentioned, while he and other people were indicted and actually found guilty, Ronald Reagan, who was president at that time, did not. But the idea was, did he have prior knowledge to this? And was he did he have information that implicated him as knowing? Kind of relaying this back to what was the Watergate scandal, and that led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. So really quickly for our lesson overview, we're going to talk about the end of the Cold War. We're into kind of like in the final stages. We're going to kind of go through a lot of changes and kind of talk about changes that were happening in the Soviet Union, as well as changes that were happening inside the United States. And then we're going to talk about the impact on our economy. So this is going to be 9.3 and 9.4. Our expectations are, you're going to look at the causes and effects of the at the end of the Cold War and its legacy. You're also going to look at the causes and effects of economic and technological change over time. So again, you're looking at cause and effect, and you're also looking at CCOT. So kind of a reminder, you guys have already learned about claims and evidence and sources, what that means, how you look at evidence as the one we just looked at. Look at the claim that is being made with the point of view, and then citing evidence from content of knowledge that you've already acquired. And then, of course, contextualization, as always, is that giant big picture. What's happening at this, what's going on at the world is at this time, both foreign and domestic within the United States. And so we're still looking at developments and processes, which is extremely important. And with any DBQ, this is one of your areas where you definitely have to earn points, where you corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument using diverse and alternative evidence in order to develop a complex argument. This is one of the harder points, a complexity point for students to earn. And so when it says that, when you corroborate, qualify, or modify, you're basically either going to change it, you're either going to agree with it, or you're going to disagree with it. And you're going to have to use alternative evidence, meaning something beyond the documents, meaning something that the documents don't have, but you know that it actually does prove your point in your argument. All right. So one of the important things we mentioned, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this is pretty much a rendition of what they wanted the Strategic Defense Initiative to look like. It was proposed by Reagan in 1983. He had just taken office at this time. We're still looking at as space exploration. We had still had those dreams. We're still kind of not really in a competition with Russia, but this new deal for SDI was this theory that they could launch like these weapons, or not really weapons, but kind of like monitors. And from space, if there was a nuclear weapon that was launched into the atmosphere, they would have the ability to destroy that before it actually landed in its intended destination. It got its nickname from Star Wars, which of course was a big, huge movie franchise that was starting out during that time. The first one, Star Wars, had already kind of came out, and so they just kind of looked at it that way because of the fact that they were going to launch this technology into space, and it would give a better perspective versus just what was done in the past, which is everybody kind of standing and looking in the sky to see what was happening. It was a nuclear shield, and it was supposed to be, or a space shield that was supposed to prevent a nuclear attack. And of course, it was kind of going away from what was called MAD, or mutually assured destruction. In other words, if Russia and if Cuba, who also had nuclear weapons at the time, decided to launch a weapon, we would have enough time to be proactive versus reactive. A lot of the stop, drop, and roll, duck and cover drills that were done in like the 50s and the 60s are no longer going to be pertinent at this time because of this whole SDI situation. It was a good idea in theory. Unfortunately, the system was never deployed. And for Reagan, he realized that there's a lot of changes that are happening. Leadership has also changed inside of Russia. They've went through several different premiers, and he realized that maybe this current premier might be someone that he could actually do a little bit more. Have a little bit of ability to end this Cold War so that everyone can kind of go back into the business. And so I refer to this as the Cold War thawing, because it never, although it heated up between the United States and the Soviet Union, it never actually ever came to fruition. The only kind of, I guess, definite hot spot that almost could have potentially started World War III would have definitely have been that Cuban Missile Crisis. So at this time, we see Soviet leadership under Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was a little bit different than his predecessors. Whereas they were more focused in on communism, Gorbachev really kind of saw that capitalism was more so something that they could model inside of Russia, or Soviet Union. Apologize. And so he came up with these two theories. They were called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, meaning being more open to trade, being opening up those markets, really kind of looking at the ideas for what was happening out in the global trade. And then perestroika was a complete economic, political restructuring, meaning we're not going to do with the whole idea of communism, which is, of course, if you remember, communism was the rise of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and that there is no specific ownership. Everybody owns everything. But of course, the way that communism was being practiced inside of Russia, it wasn't actually true communism. And so, what he decided to do with glasnost and perestroika, once he kind of introduced that and realized that there were other situations happening within his country that he needed to fix, it kind of led to the Cold War kind of thawing. He was a little bit more warmer. He was a little bit more welcoming, and in comparison to his predecessors, he did. Hold several summit meetings with Reagan, especially during his second term. And basically, what they decided to do was to reduce nuclear arms. They had already started doing this with SALT 1 and SALT 2 under Nixon, but this is going to be a major start. And this one's called the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. Start, and it happens in the 90s. And basically, what they decided is that there is no point in them continuing to try to build nuclear weapons. They had already at this point had one of the most biggest bombs that ever existed, which was the H bomb. And that was definitely going to have mutually assured destruction. And so by now, they're looking at reducing the nuclear arsenals to 50%. Mikhail Gorbachev has already indicated to Reagan that he is more concerned about raising the economy inside of the Soviet Union versus trying to attack the United States. So again, the relationship between the two is kind of thawing. I wanted to give you guys take a few minutes and see if you can scan this QR code. If there's ever a really cute way that you want to understand the Cold War and just where we are up until this point of thawing, it is going to be Dr. Seuss's, and I always get tongue twisted when I say this, The Butter Battle book. It's a really, really cute cartoon that talks about the Ukes and the Zooks, and basically they are trying to outbuild weaponry. And this was actually an allegory that Dr. Seuss created in relation to what was happening with the Cold War. And you guys take a look at that. We're going to ask a question tomorrow on Twitter about the ending and why you think Dr. Seuss ended the book the way he ended it. So just a few more seconds for you to scan that QR code. All right. So, besides the changes in the Soviet Union and the fall of communism, we're also going to realize that the Soviet Union is actually going to change their name. They're going to go back to being called Russia once the end of the Cold War happened. But another big significant thing, a big symbol, the whole Iron Wall that was mentioned by Winston Churchill in 1945, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was huge. In a speech that Reagan gave, he basically asked Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And of course, it will culminate kind of the end, beginning of peace. Um, Later, it will actually come down on November 9th in 1989. And it will, for the first time, combine both East and West Germany and kind of go back to that plan that was originally created at the end of World War II, where they wanted to raise the economy inside of Germany, and of course, what happened afterwards with at the end of that, how Stalin did not want to do that and how he wanted to kind of keep the East and the West separate from each other. And he felt like it was well within his rights to kind of do that, especially since Berlin fell into his quadrant and he was supposed to be responsible for that area. So, as we're looking at the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're really starting to see the transitions. We're really starting to see that Russia no longer concerned with the United States as far as nuclear weapons. They're looking at trying to really kind of build their economy and kind of come back from the economic decline that they had been suffering underneath the past leaders. Other things that are happening, while we're not really kind of fighting or engaging inside of wars, we are looking at situations that are happening outside of the United States. And one of the biggest areas that happened during Reagan's presidency was in North Africa and Libya, where they had an alleged involvement of a bombing at a Berlin club that injured American soldiers. Now, by this time, even though we have weapons of mass destruction, Ronald Reagan does not want to use those weapons of mass destruction, nor does he want to engage in any type of war. He's really kind of concerned about turning the economy around, really kind of doing what is called trickle down economics, or you'll hear about it tomorrow, known as Reaganomics. And he's looking at the fact that he does need to do something. He looked at the mistakes that were made by Jimmy Carter during the Iran hostage situation. He did not want to have a situation that's going to leave a big mark on his presidency. So he decided that yes, he is going to authorize the bombing of ground targets inside of Libya. But he was very forthcoming with the American government, with the nation, in his address when he made the quote: "When our citizens are attacked or abused anywhere in the world or on direct orders of hostile regimes, we will respond so long as I'm in this office." In other words, he will not be in the business of negotiating with any type of terroristic threats against the United States, against soldiers and citizens alike. He will respond in kind. This was mentioned yesterday. You guys watched a wonderful clip. Mr. Horton did an awesome job of setting that up, and I wanted to kind of bring this back up again because this was our warm up, but also because this had the potential of leaving an ugly mark on Reagan's presidency. The Iran-Contra affair, and about how even though we weren't supposed to be selling weapons to governments that were engaged in hostile takeover, there was the fact that there were some individuals who were secretly selling weapons to Iran, basically in a negotiation to release American hostages that were held inside of Lebanon. While this was also going on, you also had another group that was inside of Nicaragua, and the idea that you did have people who were inside of the federal government who were also selling weapons. So basically, selling weapons to guerrilla groups who were using it in order to engage in hostile takeovers or to overthrow governments. Um, Again, both of those were illegal. And a lot of people were indicted, including Oliver North, who we saw in the beginning with that political cartoon. And of course, while they were looking to see what Reagan knew and if he had any dealings with this, as it turns out, he was never actually brought, and no charges were ever brought. But they were thinking that it might have led to an impeachment process. The charges were brought against Oliver North and several others that were inside of the president's administration, and many of them had lost their positions as a result of this. And so, again, this was kind of a potential ugly mark, and it also could have been the potential of possibly starting an additional continuing on to the Cold War. But fortunately, they were able to narrow it down and go ahead and kind of end their involvement with this situation. And then we have this, the Gulf War. Now, by this time, Reagan has left office. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, came into office. And this was huge. This happened in 1990. And ironically, I remember this very vividly because I was actually in the sixth grade when the Gulf War was happening. And my father actually was fought in the Gulf War. And this was responding to an Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Kuwait. And I can remember as a kid watching this on the news and kind of wondering, like, why would a massive country like Iraq invade this little small country? But he invaded the country of Kuwait. He was trying to gain control over the oil fields because a lot of the world's oil supply was done in the Middle East, and Kuwait had a lot of oil fields within that. And Saddam Hussein wanted to control the market on the oil fields. He especially wanted to kind of control foreign trade. He felt like a lot of governments that were coming into the Middle East were kind of taking advantage, and so he wanted to put a stop to that. And so for 6 weeks, from January and February 1991, the United States led this whole coalition, and it wasn't just us, it was 34 nations that began kind of an intensive bombing campaign. Um, they bombed Iraq. They did several different operations. It was known as Operation Desert Storm, and of course, kind of fighting back and kind of pushing Saddam Hussein and back into Iraq in order to kind of keep Kuwait safe. Eventually, though, it does kind of end in a ceasefire in 1991. Hussein did agree to like a ceasefire agreement, and he did release Kuwait from underneath Iraqi control, and he pulled back the soldiers. But of course, one of the things that we were concerned about was in order for them to engage in this type of attack, did they have any weapons of mass destruction, or did they have plans on having any weapons of mass destruction? And so this is going to kind of start a whole situation where the United States is going to start looking at Saddam Hussein as being a potential world terrorist, especially since the fact that he did attack Kuwait, and again, trying to control the lucrative oil supply. This situation actually will continue on for well throughout the rest of Bush's presidency, all the way up into Clinton. It's not actually even going to be resolved until his son. George W. Bush comes into office. So you'll see that this is going to be a continue. So he's going to actually become like public enemy number one for the United States as a result of this Gulf War situation. So while we are into the Cold War and the Soviet Union has now fallen and now became Russia, they have now implemented things that are going to be more into capitalism and trying to rebuild their economy. What does that mean for America? How is our economy going to change? What are some things that we're putting into place? And so we're going to kind of look at the topic of globalization and what that meant and what they were trying to do with globalization. And this is more so going to happen in the Clinton presidency. George H.W. Bush was only president for 4 terms. The Gulf War situation, and then, of course, him having to raise taxes in order to send people over to fight this war, ended up causing him to be a 1-term president. And so we're trying to still rebuild our economy because of this and everything that has happened with the Cold War and just all of the initiatives that we had put into place with building these weapons of mass destruction. So Clinton is looking to change things around with this whole theory of globalization. So what is it? First of all, it's a process of technological, economic, political, and cultural exchanges. It makes us more interconnected and more interdependent. In other words, open markets for everyone. There's going to be trade, not just within the United States and us in certain countries, not just within UN countries, but pretty much a whole global thing where we're going to basically, go down to South America, Australia, New Zealand, China, and really, really kind of make that more interconnected and interdependent place. Going over into the continent of Africa and trading with many countries there, such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, etc. It is not new. They had those developments well before then, but of course, in the and because of everything that happened in the 90s, things are going to be accelerated, and it is going to kind of it's going to stir a debate about globalization because now what we're looking at is a lot of jobs that were pretty much only made that was actually held by Americans are now going to be taken to foreign countries because of the idea of the accessibility of a cheaper workforce. And so you have some people who are going to say that globalization was great for them because they were able to buy, cheaper parts in other countries in order to build things like automobiles. Factories are going to be doing the same thing. You will have that type of advantage as far as, companies being able to rebuild themselves up with currency. But the disadvantages is it is going to lead to some unemployment for a lot of people. And so it has been kind of seen as an uneven effect with people, with industries, and about how some countries were able to take advantage of this more so than other countries. And so here's a question for you guys in Twitter. Thinking about everything I talked about with globalization, just kind of giving a brief overview and looking at that last bullet point with the fact that it is uneven, how some people, industries, and countries are benefiting more, globalization could be compared to what other economic system that was driving our country before it actually became our country. So while we watch this video, I'm going to see if you guys can guess what I'm talking about on Twitter.
Globalization, a catch-all term that redefines many of the rules of an earlier, much simpler economic order.
There's globalization of the media so that you can see the same messages in different countries of the world. There's globalization in terms of money with financial flows in which computer links can make billions of dollars change hands instantly.
I now declare that each of you is a citizen of the United States.
There's globalization in terms of migration with people moving from country to country. So there are a variety of different things going on.
Globalization is a very complex process, and there are several sets of actors involved in it. There are the nation states, and they are more active according to their power in the international system, so obviously the US is most active. But there are also corporations, which have got bigger and more multinational, and are operating in more countries, and so it's difficult for us to know who owns some local store,
I think one of the big trends that's really contributed to what has come to be called globalization is deregulation. This notion that government shouldn't be interfering in any way with corporate decision-making. That is a global phenomenon, though it varies in extent and nature from country to country. So by default, almost, if the governments take a back seat, that means that corporations can do as they please. And so I think we have seen, a lot more of that. And if you put that together with things like lower transportation costs, cheaper communications, plus the lack of any restriction in the case of most countries on capital movement, you get what we have come to call globalization.
While its impact may be intensifying, globalization is really nothing new.
There's been more globalization than many people understood back in the 1950s, 1900. And in fact, when we begin to look at the data on things like integration between different parts of the world, investment in different parts of the world, trade between different parts of the world, we find that the world was pretty globalized 100 years ago. So it's not all that different in some ways.
People have been migrating for years, money has been changing hands, but it's accelerated in the 1990s and afterwards, and there's been a new speed to it.
Every society is connected, one way or the other, to every other society. And the dramatic increases in communications and transportation technologies so that capital can literally move at the speed of light around the world. People can travel the world in one day. You can pile containers on ships and bring cheap products from Asia to the United States. So everything that happens now in the world has an effect on the United States, and conversely, everything the United States does, as the dominant power in the world, has an effect on what goes on elsewhere.
Globalization is nothing if not controversial. It can certainly be very positive for multinational corporations, as well as for some individuals. But for others, particularly ordinary working people, it can be very threatening.
The more people are empowered as individuals to be able to get a good job or to travel around the world, the easier it is to embrace globalization. If your experience of globalization is that you lose your job, then you experience it not as an exciting opportunity to travel around the world, see different things, and make your fortune, but as losing something that worked for you in your local community or in your country. And that's going on all around the world, that people have worked, often for hundreds of years, to make a community viable, only to see its major industry move away.
With the available cheap labor pool now expanded to include the far corners of the world, there's often very little financial incentive for U.S. employers to hire domestic workers.
If you have a problem with your computer or if you want to make a phone call, you're probably going to talk to someone in Bangalore, India, not to an American, but someone there is looking for much less. And middle-class jobs are increasingly being exported, so that if you have a complicated tax return, it's probably going to be done overseas by someone who will work for $10 an hour instead of $50 an hour. If you want your plans drawn for your building, it's very likely they're going to be drawn in Budapest, Hungary, as they are in the United States. If you have an insurance claim, it's a good possibility that that insurance claim is going to be processed overseas by a worker who's willing to work for less. Even very high-wage people like radiologists with computer technology, their X-rays and MRIs can be sent overseas and interpreted for a third of the price that they would be interpreted in the United States.
It's been described as a race to the bottom in which each country, each poor country, is pitted against the other. And a company in the United States can say, well, if you won't do it cheaper for us, we'll go to the next country. We can always get it cheaper. There's always somebody else who's willing to sell their labor for less. So they just are, like nomads seeking out the best and the best deal they can get in the most oppressed workforce.
Capital.
All right, so just kind of looking at the globalization and the impact that it would have. Congratulations, Jenny, Bolivar Campusano, and Nikki Modi for guessing correctly. If you compare globalization of what I'm talking about to a system, it would definitely have been mercantilism. We had a lot of people that guessed the Columbian Exchange, and the only reason why it was not the Columbian Exchange was while there are European countries that did benefit, when it talks about labor force, everything was forced. So it wasn't as if they went to the country and said, hey, we're going to pay you. It was, you're going to work with it for us, and you're going to be our slaves. And once that slave labor ended with the Native Americans, then they realized that Africans would actually be another labor force that they can get. And so they, again, started the whole slave trade. But mercantilism definitely, because they were actually paying the colonists some money. It just wasn't a lot of money, and then they were taking advantage of them by basically saying, you have to ship us your raw goods and your raw materials. We will then make it here and then ship it back to you so that you can buy. So again, that's why globalization is best fit with mercantilism versus the Columbian Exchange. With the rise of globalization, what did that mean? The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War in 1991, and the world became more interconnected. It also meant that those countries that are part of the communist blocs, they're now actually going to be integrated into the global market. So yay them. No more communism is kind of being dwindled down. This is not to say that communism will not be practiced in certain countries. It's just that more countries are starting to see more benefits with globalization versus continuing to practice communism. The number one country that's still going to continue to practice communism, which still does exist today, Cuba will still imply it, and also North Korea will still continue on. You'll have technological advances such as mobile phones. And I know that is ironic considering that you guys have always grown up with mobile phones, but me growing up, and I was born in 77, I'm an 80s baby, we did not have cell phones that were readily available. We didn't have smartphones. So cell phones and the internet really kind of came about as I started going into college in the late 90s. All of that kind of connected everybody else. The World Wide Web, links, devices, all of these things are byproducts of globalization. So there's your good part of it. But of course, what it also mentioned was that the labor force was also being taken advantage of. Some other things that were impacted by globalization, something called the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, brainchild of Bill Clinton, which basically had free trade agreements between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, was signed in 92. And basically it removed a lot of barriers. It allowed the free flow of people, goods, and services. You had countries, you had a lot of companies, I'm sorry, not countries, that were starting to look into different areas where they can actually build factories, looking at Mexico as one of those places, kind of looking at, migration between borders. Why should I have a factory in the United States where it's going to cost me $1 billion to run when I can throw this factory down to Mexico and only run it for maybe $2 million? With the free trade and open markets, it did lead to a lot of job losses. And so it is going to kind of throw us into a recession a little bit. Not a depression, but a recession. You're going to start to see a spike in unemployment. You're going to start to see a lot of companies that existed at the beginning that are no longer able to keep up with the supply and demand of the markets, especially when other companies are coming out and because they invest in foreign markets or they have foreign labor, they're able to make their products faster, cheaper, and kind of going into those different sectors. And so, for some parts of it, what NAFTA was intended to do was it was supposed to increase economic growth and prosperity within America. However, not everyone saw the benefits of the NAFTA agreement, and so you did have some dissension within Congress that did not like what this was doing to the economy at the time. So, what are our dark sides? We've already kind of heard a little bit in the video. Globalization, again, will lead to greater prosperity for some places and not necessarily for all. You will talk about the exploitation, sweat factories. I don't know if you guys have kind of heard about them doing journalistic, underground journalism, kind of talking about sweat factories, about how certain products are made inside of these places in other countries where the conditions are horrible. And that should kind of remind you of another time period where they talked about employment and about how the conditions were bad, about how they were mistreated, how they were working 12 plus hours a day, poorly ventilated areas. Again, put it on Twitter, see if you can guess which period I'm kind of talking about or specific topic I'm talking about. But what did globalization do? Thanks to the World Wide Web, it led to a system of terrorist networks that use the conditions created by globalization in order to enhance their own influence, promote hate culture, and record videos and put them out there to recruit, which will, of course, lead us into what will be known as the 9/11 attacks. With the increased interconnectedness of the world, you have people who are looking at international finance have become heightened. You're looking at the fact that possibly, would we be coming into another Great Depression? But we will have what's known as the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. That compacted with everything that we were fighting with as far as over in foreign countries with war at this time, with the impact of the Gulf War and how it's going to kind of continue on. So even though globalization connected us, it did successfully help us end the Cold War. It did have some serious consequences, and it did have a lot of horrible impact that led for a lot of Americans. And we're still seeing some of that impact. Our country has pretty much kind of had some ebbs and flows, but globalization is going to be something that is going to continue. We are going to continue to be interconnected with other countries because it is important for us to be able to keep those markets open. So let's do a little bit of guided practice. All right, so this is a quote from Mikhail Gorbachev during his time, kind of talking about the fact at the end of the Cold War. So look at it and answer that question, which is which U.S. foreign policy was most consistent with the goal articulated in the statement above? All right, and so the correct answer will be détente in 1970s. And if you remember, détente was that policy by Richard Nixon, who wanted to kind of pull back as far as the amount of weapons that we were actually producing at this time. I hear from my cohort, from my partner in crime, that a lot of you did guess correctly when I talked about the dark side of the globalization and what it be compared to. And if you guessed the Gilded Age, you are correct. All right, same quote, different question. Okay, in the spirit of time, we're going to try to go ahead and answer this one. The correct answer is marked by bellicose rhetoric. The question is, early in his presidency, Ronald Reagan's relationship with the Soviets was marked by bellicose rhetoric. In other words, just kind of, it's just a lot of rhetoric, really kind of looking at the impact and really kind of talking about how we can possibly end this war. And then you're looking at Gorbachev, who's saying, let's not talk about who won it, or let's not even fuss about it. Let's just look at it was in both of our interests to go ahead and end this war so that we can kind of move forward, and that we need to try to look at cooperation. We do want to kind of go look at cooperation. We don't try to promote this country is better than that country kind of thing. All right, checks for understanding. Very quickly, this is talking about globalization. Anthony Giddens in 1999. So this is a secondary source. Okay, so the question is, since 2000, which of the following economic phenomena is most consistent with the argument in the passage above? And the correct answer is D, economic instability and major policy changes. All right, same passage, different question, which is, oh, sorry, this is actually the same question. So let's move forward. All right, so let's just kind of talk about our key takeaways. Number one, we know that it's the end of the Cold War. We know that this will lead to new diplomatic relationships. We're talking about new U.S. military and other options for peacekeeping interventions. The other thing that's a big major takeaway is that economic productivity increased as improvements. We also looking at the foray into the digital world. It also allowed for increased American participation inside of world economic opportunities. Biggest things that you need to take from this lesson is the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That, of course, kind of definitely is a huge signal to the end of that Iron Curtain that existed during that time. The situations that were happening in the Middle East and also in North Africa, the movement with Libya and with the Middle East, kind of talking about what will be Kuwait, and also with the Iran-Contra situation. That also kind of brought is in its own thing, the Iran-Contra affair, and how it could have potentially put a huge black mark on the Reagan presidency for those that were involved. And then, of course, the impact that globalization will have as far as putting us into another global market, but at the same time, still had a dark and ugly side. And so the learning objective was explain the extent to which the events of the periods from 1945 to 1980 reshaped national identity. It meaning, in other words, where are we in America? Where does America stand from this point going forward? Where do we go from here? Now that the Cold War is over, now that we're engaging in globalization, now that we have NAFTA, where do we go from here? So very quickly, here is a potential question that you could have, even if this was part of a DBQ. Says that some historians have argued that conservative victories during Reagan's presidency marked an enduring shift in American politics from 1980 to 2008. Support, modify, or refute this connection using specific evidence. I'm going to give you a few minutes to kind of think about everything that you've learned over the last couple of days since we started period 9 and even the end of period 8. Okay, very quickly, here are some possible things that you could say. During his first term, he used aggressive, bellicose, threatening, materialistic tone in speeches and policy. This strategy was an escalation of both rhetoric and military action. Some considered it to be a return to brinkmanship. And what brinkmanship, that basically was talking about MAD, mutually assured destruction. And that's why that was kind of a different comparison to how Gorbachev was talking in his speech in 1990. And then, of course, you could say this: during his second term, he began to moderate his aggressive rhetoric towards the Soviets and made some diplomatic overtures. He remained firm on a strong U.S. military presence, but he also sought opportunities for more dialogue and diplomatic meetings. So again, if this were, some things that you had, if this was part of a DBQ, part of the question that you need to answer, you didn't have documents to kind of go into that, these are some things that you could look at. Remember, as we were talking about creating a list and kind of going through and relying on your knowledge before you even look at the documents. All right, so something to think about for tomorrow. I asked this question before, I'm going to bring it up again, is what is our role in the world today? Really kind of think about that. And don't forget, very quickly, if you're still having issues with technology or know someone who is, go to cb.org/tech. And as always, thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. I'll see you guys on Friday.